Hello and welcome to Renew. Renew is a show about the College of Forest Resources at Mississippi State University. The College of Forest Resources supports and enables the conservation, wise use, and management of your natural resources. I'm your host, Leslie Berger. Today's show is going to feature the Department of Forestry, one of the three departments within the College of Forest Resources. And here to represent the Department of Forestry is Assistant Professor Krishna Pawadel. Thank you for joining me today, Krishna.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for inviting me to this.
Well, I'm glad that you were able to join us during these unprecedented times that we have. I appreciate you taking your time and visiting with us via Skype from your home. I know you're new to Mississippi State. You haven't been here very long. So could you just give us a little overview of your path to Mississippi State?
Yes, of course. So I'm originally from Nepal. And I did my undergraduate in Nepal, and I came to the United States in 2009. I went to LSU, Louisiana State University, for my master's degree. And then after completing my master's, I went to Oregon State for my PhD in forest biometrics. And then after finishing my PhD in forest biometrics in 2015, I worked as a postdoc at Oregon State for about 3 years. And I started this current position as an assistant professor of forest biometrics at Mississippi State in 2018, August of 2018. And so since then I've been teaching some classes and doing some research at Mississippi State University.
Well, we're glad that you joined us. And you had one sort of normal year before the abnormal year that we have going with us right now. So hopefully things will kind of level out and you'll get to see kind of what life is really like at Mississippi State when we don't have a pandemic going on. You mentioned that you did your work, your most recent work out of Oregon. People that are watching may not fully appreciate how forest systems differ across the U.S. and really across the globe, but there's some differences between what you're working with there in Oregon and what you have encountered here at Mississippi State, what you would have seen at LSU as well. So how do forest practices differ kind of in general terms between what you're working with there in Oregon and what we have here in the Southeast?
Yeah, I think the main objective is for forest management, we have similar objective, like we want to maximize our benefit, what we can get from the environment or by managing forest. But I think the main difference in Oregon and in Mississippi is the ownership. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, most of the forest is owned by public, like it's a public land. And in Mississippi or in the South, we have mostly privately owned forest. So what that means is we have different management options or management practices. So we manage our forest differently. And that means our rotation is when we harvest, what kind of management practices we use, they differ. For example, if you think of prescribed burning, for example, in the South, we use fire for prescribed burning, but in Pacific Northwest, prescribed burning is not that common.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the main difference is in ownership, and then because of that, we have different management approach, and that determines how long we manage our forest for such objective.
Right, and I can see where that ownership issue would be a significant one that goes beyond just the obvious things that you might think about with that. A lot of your work has been related to biomass, forest biomass, and ways to assess that. So imagine you're talking to your grandmother, and maybe she's just still in Nepal, and you have to explain what biomass is to her. How would you describe that term?
Yeah, so biomass, if I had to describe biomass to my grandmother, then I would say this is the dry weight. For me, it will be dry weight of everything that we find in the forest. So it includes all the plants, shrubs, trees, shrubs, vines, everything, both above ground and below ground. But my work is mostly focused on above ground estimation, because below ground estimation is difficult, so I have to avoid
Right.
the below ground biomass estimation.
Right. So that's a good definition of it. You brought some, well, you didn't bring because we're not visiting face to face like we normally do, but you sent some pictures in advance that kind of illustrate some of the work that you're doing. So we're going to cycle through those. Could you give a little explanation of those photos as we're looking at them?
Yes. So this one is the related to one of the projects I was working on, or I'm currently working on. So what we are doing is our objective is to find the total dry weight of the whole tree. So in this example, we are harvesting this tree, and now so after this, we will measure different dimension of the trees. For example, diameter at different height, and then we will. So for example, here we are using calipers to measure diameter, and we will then limb all the branches and then get the weights of the branches as well. So what that does is we can get the separate weight of different tree components. And once we that for some sample trees, we can develop some models so that we can estimate for the future. We can estimate what biomass is single tree without having to harvest them in the future.
Right, that makes sense. So you take a small sample, you estimate the amount of biomass that's in this small sample, and instead of having to measure the entire forest to get an estimate of the entire forest, you can extrapolate what you've learned from this small sample and say, therefore, we estimate the total biomass for this forest to be X.
Yes, exactly. And ultimately, our goal in that project is to convert that into carbon, so that we can say, so we have this much forest in the United States and this much biomass. So if we have this much biomass, so what is the carbon that our forests are capturing? And in this picture, this is a different project. It deals with short rotation woody crops. You can see cottonwood here. So what we are trying to do is what kind of spacing and what kind of harvest scheduling should we do to maximize the biomass production from these short rotation woody crops.
Right. So we are the College of Forest Resources, and we do try to promote, as we say in our intro, the sustainable use of our natural resources. You mentioned that part of the reason why you're trying to estimate the biomass in those forests is related to carbon, and I'm assuming you're also then referring to carbon sequestration. So from a standpoint of renewability and environmental sustainability, what does that mean?
So I think now we all kind of agree that the global climate is warming. So we have that, and then the easiest way to capture carbon or capture greenhouse gases is to manage more forest. So my research is focusing on estimating how much carbon is actually being captured by managing different forests throughout the United States. So I started this project when I was at Oregon State, and there are 7 different universities involved in this project, and we all are following the same sampling protocol and estimating protocol, so that we have a consistent estimate of biomass and ultimately carbon, so that when we report about so what is the environmental impact of managing this forest, then we can say with higher accuracy that this is the amount of carbon that are being captured by the forest, and that is how forests are helping us in mitigating climate change.
Okay. Yes, and so the flip side of that then is there are individuals, groups of people who perhaps don't understand the role of timber harvest in forest management, in ecosystem management, and they actually might even use your argument against you and say, well, if we're using these trees to capture carbon and then you cut the trees down, now you're reducing our global ability to capture carbon out of the atmosphere by cutting these trees down. So what is your counter argument to that then? How do you balance this need that we have to sustainably produce food and fiber and other products that come from forests with this need to sequester carbon?
Yes, I think the key word here is sustainable. So if we are harvesting sustainably, then we are not deteriorating the environment, right? And then, for example, these days there is a growing interest in using wood as a long-term product. For example, there are high-rise buildings being built using wood. So if we can use timber as a long-term product, then we are storing carbon for long term. So it definitely has benefit compared to using concrete or other steel. So.
Right, no, and that's an excellent point. If we can figure out how to keep wood from rotting, then it keeps it tied up. We don't have to harvest as frequently because the need is different, and we replant, and that's the important part. It's not just a take and not replace, but it is being replanted. It's a different system. It doesn't function exactly like a normal natural forest does, but it does provide environmental benefits, including carbon sequestration, watershed protection, and some other things. So it's a balance, just like you said. It's that balance between use and need and keeping that long-term goal of sustainability that we perhaps didn't have in the early history of our U.S. Now we're recognizing some of our errors and trying to make those changes. You had mentioned that you do teach classes on campus, and so you're interacting with students, graduate students and undergrad. How do you bring the research that you're doing into to your teaching?
Yeah, so I include my research in teaching in two ways. The first one is if I am teaching a undergraduate level class. For example, I teach biometrics, first biometrics class, and in that class I use data from my actual research to present what is the question that we are trying to answer. And then I teach students, so if this is your question you are trying to answer, then you have to collect this kind of data, and then this is how you would analyze that data. And secondly, I include or I involve undergraduate students in my research by hiring them or recruiting them as a student worker in my research. And also at MSU, we have the undergraduate research scholar program. So I have a student working on that project as well. So this is how I try to integrate my research with teaching.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate you taking time out to visit with us today, and I have really enjoyed learning more about your program. I look forward to you doing great things in the College of Forest Resources. We're excited to have you in our mix and on our faculty. For the rest of you, thank you for joining us today on Renew. I hope that you've learned a little bit more about sustainable use of forestry and carbon sequestration, estimating biomass in our forests, and some of the research that's happening at Mississippi State University. Until we meet again, I wish you the best. I've been your host, Leslie Berger.